The two poems I chose were I Never Saw a Moor and Faith is a Fine Invention by Emily Dickinson. First I will read I Never Saw a Moor. I never saw a moor, I never saw the sea, yet know I how the heather looks and what a wave must be. I never spoke with God or visited in heaven, yet certain I am of the spot, as if the checks were given. Next you'll hear Faith is a Fine Invention. Faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. The theme of these poems was that science triumphs God in certain cases and questions his existence. For both poems, I chose to analyze symbolism, denotation and connotation, punctuation, and the author's background. I never saw the moor, I never saw the sea, yet know I how the heather looks and what a wave must be. I never spoke with God or visited in heaven, yet certain I am of the spot, as if the checks were given. Some words I thought would be necessary to define to get a better understanding of the poem were moor, an open overgrown land; heather, plant often seen in a moor; checks, which in this case refers to a railroad ticket that says what the destination is; and God, a spirit of being that has great power, strength, knowledge, etc. It can affect nature and the lives of people. For this poem, I didn't find a real rhyme scheme, but I found that the first and third stanza are slant rhyme, and the second and fourth lines are rhyming for both stanzas. Like I said earlier, the theme of the poem was that science triumphs God in certain cases and questions his existence. When you first read the poem, it may be hard to understand how this relates to science. But in the first stanza of every word at the end of each line, it has to do with something about nature, which often correlates with science, which leads into my first major literary element, symbolism. Emily Dickinson used the words moor, sea, heather, and wave in her poem. These words symbolize nature and science. During this time period, Darwinism was introduced, and it questioned people's religion or personal beliefs in God. Dickinson used these words to contrast science and God, and how it can be just as sure God exists as people are about science and biological evolution. But it's hard to know how the introduction of Darwinism affected her community without knowing Emily Dickinson's background. Emily Dickinson was raised with religion surrounding her. She grew up in a Calvinist household. Calvinism basically says that God has already chosen who believes in him and who will be saved. She went to Amherst First Congregational Church. Congregationalism was the main denomination for where she lived. As she grew up, different denominations began to emerge like Methodists, Baptists, Unitarians, and later on, Catholics. You could even see how church music influenced her poems, because many meters and hymns are apparent in her poetry. But as Emily Dickinson grew up, Darwinism, which is basically biological evolution based on natural selection, was introduced. When this happened, you saw a great divide in her society with people's perception of God, nature, and science. With this new knowledge in mind, it helped me understand the denotation and connotation meaning of the poem. Denotation is the literal meaning of something. So when I never saw a moor, Emily Dickinson is talking or writing about her personal viewpoints on God. She believes in his existence. Dickinson is saying that even though she never saw a moor or the sea, she is certain that they exist. It would be absurd if they didn't. She's using this argument to say that even though she has never seen heaven or God, she is just as certain he exists as the sea does. So basically, she's saying that she doesn't need solid proof to know that God exists. Connotation is a word or feeling that a word invokes in addition to its literal meaning. In the poem, Emily Dickinson has used certain words like moor, sea, heather, and wave, which all deals with science. When she was growing up, the concept of Darwinism was introduced, like I said earlier. When this was introduced, religions, mainly Christianity, was questioned in many households. Emily Dickinson was expressing her feelings on how this newfound theory was not going to change her surety that God is real. Punctuation, evidently, was a device that helped me understand the meaning of the poem even more. In the first stanza of I Never Saw Moor, there's a dash after Moor and sea. She is emphasizing these two lines' importance so we could understand the parallel it has with the second stanza's first two lines, I never spoke with God, and nor visited in heaven. She also puts a great deal of emphasis on yet in the line that says, yet I know how the heather looks, to show she knows what's real and what's not. It's her reality. This line parallels with the second stanza, where they also put a lot of emphasis on yet. The line reads, yet certain I am of the spot. In the first stanza, the line that is similar to the second stanza's line kind of refers to everyone's reality, in common knowledge, that the heather exists. She uses the same tone with the line in the second stanza to show her surety that God exists, and it's common knowledge for her that he does. Not to mention that these two lines both have 8 syllables. The theme of these poems was that science triumphs God in certain cases and questions his existence. This poem uses words like moor, sea, heather, etc. in a way that symbolizes science, and in the second stanza, she uses words that relate to God and Christianity. During the time when this poem was written, Darwinism was introduced, which made people question whether God existed, and put science above God. Emily Dickinson is saying she doesn't need proof to know that God exists, and science shouldn't come before God. She's showing a parallel between people's arguments about science to her personal argument for God. Faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. Some words I chose to define to get a better meaning of the poems were faith, to believe or trust, devotion to or trust in somebody or something, especially without logical proof. See, in this case, means the ability to believe in God. Microscopes, a magnifying instrument, a device that uses a lens or system of lens to produce a greatly magnified image of an object. And prudent, having good sense in dealing with practical matters. The rhyme scheme of this poem is ABCB. In case you forgot, the theme of these poems is that science triumphs God in certain cases and questions his overall existence. Unlike I Never Saw Moor, it's more evident that this poem relates to science because of its vocabulary and what it symbolizes. Simply put, microscopes symbolize science, or for the connotation meaning, which we'll discuss later, practical or straightforward thinking. Faith symbolizes God, religion, or what you put your trust in. Gentlemen symbolize society, or maybe in particular, Christians. It's a little hard to understand the connotation meaning of the word microscope without knowing the denotation and connotation meaning of the poem. Denotation. This poem is saying basically that God or faith is good when people fully believe in it. But science triumphs it when there is something that is more important or when there is an emergency. Connotation. Some argue that Emily Dickinson isn't trying to say that science triumphs God in emergencies, but instead that there should be some sort of a balance between faith and science. She's saying that you need to believe and have hope in God, but at the same time, you shouldn't solely depend on your emotions. You need to have science or the actual physical aspect of it. To summarize this, denotation is saying that science triumphs God in emergencies, but the connotation is saying that there should be some sort of a balance. We get this connotation meaning from looking back into the author's background. It's a little hard to tell how she felt when she wrote this poem, but even though Dickinson grew up in the church, she was never fully grounded on the idea of God or faith. Based off some of her poems, People think that she thought that there should be a place of worship and praise, but signs should be used over hope and prayer when it's something urgent. Emily Dickinson uses a dash after can see to separate the two opposing ideas. Placing quotation marks around faith made it seem like it isn't real, or it's almost fake. It's almost as if people think they have faith, but in actuality, no one really does. By capitalizing and italicizing microscopes, it puts an added amount of importance to it, almost as though it's above faith and sort of laughs at the idea of having faith. Like I said many times earlier, the theme of these poems was that science chimes God in certain cases and questioned his existence. This poem is saying that in urgent situations, science should be chosen before God, or that there should be a balance. Although these poems are somewhat similar, they do have a fair amount of differences. In I Never Saw Moor, it's supposed to be more of a serious poem, and she's also stating her personal views. It's like she's arguing for God. But in Faith is a Fine Invention, it's supposed to be a funnier poem, and it isn't on her personal views, but she's writing for society's views. That's why she says gentleman and not I, unlike in I Never Saw Moor, where she uses I frequently. Thank you.